Well, firstly, Kathy, really welcome for coming today and giving time in general. I'm sorry the train journey from London was a bit of a struggle, but nevertheless, you persevered and you're here. Thank you very much indeed. We appreciate you giving the time. We're going to talk today about your reflections on Maidan in 2014. And you were there at the centre of events, you played a key role, you met many of the key players, and we've decided that we would do that. Is it all working?
Yeah, it's all good.
We decided that we would do that through a series of pictures of your own participation in these events. But where I want to start is the first sentence of the chapter in your book, And Then What, of your recollections. And what you say right at the beginning of the first chapter, first sentence, Viktor Yanukovych strode into the Grand Hotel in Vilnius. I emphasize Vilnius because we're talking about the Baltic relationships. The Ukrainian president's tall, large frame was imposing, and he towered over the crowded lobby. It was a cold November day in 2013, and as the ambassador referred to, that was the start point. Why did you choose November 2013 and the meeting in Vilnius as your starting point for your reflection of this whole period?
It's great to be here, and I apologise that we had to change the programme, but apparently there was a storm here, which I missed in London, so I've had a lovely time at King's Cross looking at all the Harry Potter stuff for the last 2.5 hours, but it's great that I finally made it, so thank you for putting up with that. And I've already said hello to my dear friend Erki, who was one of the ministers that I had the privilege of serving with in the European Union. And I must say hello to Vagoudis again, who served as the first proper European Union ambassador to Moscow. And just to say as a thought that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, was a bit surprised that I'd appointed a Lithuanian to represent the entirety of the EU. But there was nobody quite like you. But it does begin, in a way, in Vilnius, because although it's not the beginning of the story, of course, we had been negotiating with Yanukovych and with Ukraine for 7 years to get the association agreement to the point of being initialed, as it had been in the spring. And you will know initialing means concluded in terms of any negotiations. It was ready for the great signature. But it was the moment when what was going to happen kind of came firmly into view. Although a lot of that was unknown, a lot of it was unpredicted, certainly by me, it was the moment when a lot of things became clear and a lot of things suddenly started to happen. And it was an extraordinary event because it was the meeting of the Eastern Partnership countries, 6 of them, with the leaders of the European Union, and the whole centrepiece of the meeting was the signing of the association agreement with Ukraine. So part of the reason I began my story there was, in a way, it was a bit of a surprise that Yanukovych had turned up at all, because all he was doing was turning up to be shouted at by absolutely everybody that he came across. He had no excuses at that time. He just kept saying to me, Kathy, it's only a pause. The truth, of course, was something else. So it begins for me, in my experiences, although I'd been to Ukraine, I was at his inauguration, although I knew him and knew many of the people from Ukraine, for me, my story, my engagement, and the beginning of what was to happen was all about Vilnius.
So the first photo is not there. Right. So you're with him there at the demonstrations in November 2013. What's the importance of this photo and how that went? It's not just meeting him, but it's the context of the meeting. It
is. I mean, I've got hundreds of pictures. We've only chosen a very few for today. And these are my pictures of the time. But after Vilnius, when he had pointed out yet again that he couldn't sign, that he had left and gone back, you will all know, and some of you were there, that the demonstrations in Maidan not only began, but grew. And not only in Maidan, by the way, all over the country, from people who were deeply concerned that the platform upon which Yanukovych had stood to bring Ukraine with an association agreement closer to the European Union was being betrayed. And I went, of course, to Kyiv to see him. And this is a photograph of me talking to him. I say talking to him. If you've ever sat down with Yanukovych, you don't get much chance to say very much. It's a lot of talking at you. So for 4.5 hours, he and I discussed in our first meeting in his office at that point what was to happen. And the message I was trying to give him was he was the president of his country. It was for him to decide what to do. It was no good telling me it was a pause. It was no good telling me, as he began to, of the pressures he was under from Russia. The people he had to tell were the people standing in minus 30 degrees in the square, who were his citizens and to whom he owed a responsibility. One of the things about leadership is being responsible, and I've met far too many leaders over those years and beyond who just think that once they become leader, it's up to them what they do. It's up to them to decide what's best for their country, that they don't have a responsibility. Somehow they're untouchable. Well, he was yet another version of that phenomenon which I'd seen before and have seen since. So my meeting with him is to make that point, and also to tell him that I'm about to go to Maidan. He didn't try and stop me, I'd have gone anyway, but it was to explain to him that these people were flying EU flags, and I had a responsibility to the European Union to go and meet them, to see who they were, to find out what they thought. But so did he, as president of the country. And it was on this meeting, and at that point, I've just finished the meeting with him, that I realised he would never sign it. And that was an important moment for the European Union.
And the next slide is you going to the square, and you're in the square yourself. You've just described why you went down to the square. Can you just give a colour, really, of what it was like? There was this demonstration. Many of us will have seen demonstrations of various kinds, will have participated in demonstrations of various kinds. What was this like, and how were you treated? Were you worried for your security, your safety? Were you concerned about how you would be dealt with by regular people? And I just wondered also, Yanukovych, he would not have gone to the square, and what he thought about you doing this. You've just explained, you said you were going to do it anyway, whatever he thought, but how did the vibrations proceed?
So the square was extraordinary, and I'm standing with Arseny Yatsenyuk, who many of you will know, who became Prime Minister and who now chairs the Kyiv Security Forum. We went down, a whole group of us, Ukrainians, came with me to meet people. There were a couple of decisions that I'd taken. The first was I was not going to make a speech in the square. And the reason for that was that I knew in Moscow they would be watching this, and I knew that they would take any opportunity to say this was EU-inspired, CIA-inspired, American-inspired, and so on. And so it was really important to me that what they saw were people on the streets, people in the square, and me talking to them, not showing any level of leadership, because I was not leading this. This is the people of Ukraine, and as I've said, from that day to this, it is for the people of Ukraine to decide their future, not for any of us to tell them, but certainly for all of us to help them. The atmosphere was fantastic. It was families, it was young people, it was NGO leaders, it was journalists, it was a spectrum of people from across society in Kyiv. That was the first thing that struck me, was lots of different people. And it was very, very cold. So you know people are committed when, and this was quite late at night, when people are prepared to be there in their thousands, because each one of them represented many people who couldn't be there, or who'd been there earlier and gone home, or who would take over for, if you like, the next shift later that night or early in the morning. And the atmosphere was really positive. There was a stage, there was a clear sense that this was a movement of people who were not going to go away. But at that moment, it was a sense of determination, but in a good and positive and almost happy frame of mind. EU flags waving, people being extremely determined that they were going to make sure that what had been agreed would be implemented. And remember that we were a signature away. This was not something that had been held up by the tricks of the trade, having negotiated trade deals. You know, you can very easily find a little problem, a comma in the wrong place, whatever. None of that had happened. It was only a signature away. And they were determined that he was going to fulfill what was required of him as president.
Now, you followed that by going to Kyiv and having meetings in Ukraine. Here's a picture of you meeting a number of the key players in Ukraine. You've already described how this moment of the meeting with Yanukovych down to Maidan was almost a turning point in your mind about the possibilities for the future. What were these meetings about? What were you trying to achieve?
So we were conscious by this point, of course, that the pressure was coming from Moscow. It was very obvious that Yanukovych was taking calls from the Kremlin. Even during my meetings, he would pop out and come back. And it was very clear that for one reason or another, partly his own weakness, partly his own financial issues, partly the determination from Moscow, which was growing, that Ukraine was not going to sign this or suffer the consequences in terms of economic issues, trade and so on. And we'd seen some of that begin to happen. It was very clear that he was feeling that pressure. And the big question that you must always begin with is there a way to turn the pressure off or to counter the pressure with others who can help him? Because the thing about leadership is it's lonely. People who are not strong and determined individuals with a clear sense of vision get swayed and pushed around by forces and around them. And certainly that's true if you're trying to deal with the Kremlin and with President Putin, who I've met many, many times. So there were other people in this, other leaders, former presidents, some of the people who were rich businessmen, the oligarchs, as we like to call them, all of the different elements, and the politicians of the day, pretty much collectively of one frame of mind, which was that we should move forward. Was there a role that they could play in trying to put pressure back on him to actually fulfill his obligations and to understand what was really going on? So all of these meetings, which went on long through the night with a variety of different people and with a lot of the early representatives from Maidan as well, were trying to find those kind of solutions. And although we didn't, I would always argue that that's where you have to begin, is try and find out as much as you possibly can about what's really going on and where the solutions might be.
The next is a picture of you giving a press conference, I think, at that same period. So the question is, what were you trying to convey publicly? A lot of these discussions have obviously been in private rooms. In discussions, you'd be saying lots of things, people would say things to you. But this is a new point where you're saying, OK, this is what we think and this is what we want to convey. So what was that?
Well, there was a lot of press interest, as you can imagine, not just within Ukraine, but of course all of the countries around Ukraine and the EU and so on. So we had hundreds and hundreds of journalists had descended upon Kyiv, and you need to feed the beast at some point in the journalistic world. But also we wanted to get some messages across. So in the press conferences, we tried to say a few things. The first was that we were there to support the Ukrainian people, that the Ukrainian people had made the choice in terms of wanting to see this agreement, that we were listening to lots of their voices, that he had been elected on that platform, and we hoped that as president he would move forward with something that he had committed to. This was not to disrespect the fact that he was elected as president at all. This was not interference. And that was the other thing that I was trying to say. But I also wanted to send a message to Moscow, which was that we understood that Ukraine had, at that point, a strong relationship with Moscow. Baroness would have remembered that there was a lot of kind of interest in ensuring that there was an understanding that this was not about a failure on our part to see that in terms of the geography and the geopolitics, Russia was an important country. to Ukraine. And Ukraine was an important country to Russia. So this was about recognizing that too, and trying to make sure that there was an understanding of that in Moscow. We were obviously sending that message in lots of other ways as well. And one of the things that I did, as you know, and I talk about in the book, was I went to see Sergei Lavrov. I met him in Madrid, and we sat in the Russian ambassador's house with 2 cups of tea before a fire, the 2 of us, and talked, because I was working with the Russians on the Iran deal all the way through this period. So I met with the Russian foreign minister a large number of times in a whole range of different fora, from lots of meetings of then the G8, for meetings that took place. Indeed, he came to the Foreign Affairs Council for lunch. I don't know if I actually remember that, in 2013. So there was an ongoing dialogue, and to ask him why on earth they were doing what they were doing. So it was important to send that message, and these press conferences were an opportunity to make clear where the EU stood, what we were doing and what we were not doing, which is we were not interfering and we were not the people agitating anybody. We were responding to what the people of Ukraine wanted.
The next stage is a couple of months later, a real tragic turn in events. And this picture is of you returning to Maidan after 77 people had been killed. I wonder not just if you could just describe what's going on in the square, but why you think the people were killed, how it happened, and why you felt it important to go to the square to pay respect to them.
I continued to go back and forth to Kyiv, and what became very clear with Yanukovych was that he was more and more aggressive towards the people in the square, that he took the view that these were all agitators, they were extreme people, they were right-wing activists, whatever terminology he could come up with to kind of put them in a box marked trouble. And that he, therefore, he would say to me, saw no reason to have dialogue with them. He'd started talking to some of the political leadership, for sure, but he was not prepared to listen to the NGOs, to the journalists, to the people in the square, whoever they were, that these were agitators. And that alarmed me more and more. And we'd had messages before that they were going to use military means one way or another to clear the square. And indeed, one night, in the middle of the night, I'd had to ring the presidential palace to say, if they were going to send troops, I would have to go and stand in the square. And they just needed to know that. They didn't send troops. I didn't have to go and stand in the square. But I knew it was a postponement, not a solution to clearly what was in his mind. And so what happened, as you know, is snipers then attacked people in the square. And if you talk to, as I've done, the people who went to help them, the people who tried to save them, the doctors who were there in the square as well, you will know how awful and tragic and terrible that, not just that moment, but that period was. It was a time as well when lots of the people I was meeting would disappear for days on end and return battered and bruised, if they returned at all. That one of our colleagues was found in a wood. He'd been very badly attacked and was put in hospital, and they tried to arrest him in hospital, but we got people from the Rada to circle around the hospital and prevent them getting in while we flew him out to Vilnius. Lots of different aggressive actions going on, of which this was a culmination. And so the picture is, of course, of me laying the yellow tulips in the square. And what struck me most of all was how what had been, as I described earlier, this happy, determined group of people waving flags and so on, has become grim and dirty and full of the debris of long-term occupation. And it, in a sense, the pictures represent the difference with what was happening, because the tension and the atmosphere in Kyiv was just, you could cut it with a knife, as they say, you could touch it. It was a feeling that people knew that things were dramatically going to change. You saw people huddled on street corners in conversations very quietly. You felt life was not at all normal, and you could sense that we were moving into a much more dangerous phase of what was to happen.
Thank you. Next picture, taken at much the same time chronologically, is of you with Poroshenko. Now, he was a key figure, obviously, in the whole process, but I wonder if you could just reflect on the role he played throughout. He had a very difficult role to play, of course, but how do you feel he did? What was your relationship with him like? Did you see hope in that relationship? Was it despair? Can you just talk about that a bit?
Well, again, one of the things that we're reflecting on, by this point, of course, Yanukovych has gone, has fled. He went off to Rostov-on-Don, across the border. There was a real sense of concern and as I've said, this atmosphere within Kyiv that was extremely challenging. And people were looking for who was going to be able to do two things. One is, in a sense, sort of represent what was happening for the people of Ukraine, but also somebody who was going to be well-known enough, tough enough, big enough, whatever word you like to use, to be able to talk to Moscow. And Poroshenko, whether you like him or not, at that point emerged as somebody who might fit the bill. And as you know, he won the election very well, and was somebody who was, in my experience at that time, very prepared to be brave. He went to different parts of Ukraine. He was prepared to go and challenge what was happening in Crimea. And he became somebody that we began to talk to alongside others, as I said, former presidents, other leaders, and so on. And he built around him a much stronger coalition of political leadership from others. Whether they were in his political party or not didn't matter. There was a sense of a group of leaders who were beginning to work together to try and find a way through this. And around this time too, Tymoshenko comes out of prison and is able to, although she was very ill at this point and in need of medical treatment, I saw her as she came out, was also able to begin to play a role in terms of the politics of it. And Ukrainian politics, like politics everywhere, is very complicated, as all of you know, and there are lots of issues about who supports who and who doesn't support who, and people change. They are in favour or not in favour. But at that moment, this is how it seemed to be emerging, and indeed Poroshenko did seem to be somebody that Moscow would speak to.
Thank you. We're now moving on 6 months to our final two slides in Minsk, which we're talking about a lot during this event. If you look at this slide, you stand out, shall we say, from the other people in the picture. And I don't know what your relationships with all these people were, but I think just some words from you about Minsk and the process, how you got there, what you think, to what extent you assess it made good progress, to what extent you felt it was a disaster. What's your reflection on Minsk?
So this is not the Minsk process that everybody thinks of, because that was not done by me or by the EU, much more by the member states concerned. This was Minsk before. So this is August 2014. And I was leaving office later that year. And I was asked to go to a meeting which was chaired by Lukashenko, president of Belarus, at which there would be President Putin, President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan, President Poroshenko, as he then was, and myself with two of my commissioner colleagues from the EU. And the purpose was to try and find a way through, both economically, politically, what was happening. By this point, we know what's happening in Crimea. It's gone. There is a lot of chaos, a lot of bombing and shelling, all of the events of the Donbass, the Little Green Men, all of that is underway. And Poroshenko in particular is keen to have an opportunity to talk to Putin, but to do it in this context meant that we could kind of garner a bit more support. And indeed, what was interesting about the meeting, and there it is, this huge table, enormous table, is that it wasn't just all of those others ganging up on Ukraine and the EU. It was a much more nuanced conversation, particularly from Nazarbayev and Kazakhstan, who were interested in trying to find a way through the problems, trying to navigate both economically and politically a solution. What was significant for me was listening to Putin talk. about how he saw all of this and the events unfolding. It was clear, as it had been in Geneva when we'd done this at foreign minister level, foreign minister of Ukraine, myself, John Kerry, and the foreign minister of Russia had sat down as four to try and work through only a few weeks before what could be done. It was very clear that Putin saw this entirely negatively, saw it entirely about some level of takeover by the West, which is where, of course, the dialogue has gone since, especially in the context of what's happening now. And I have spoken to some Russians in the last couple of years, so I can tell you that this is you can see the progression of what was happening. And my sort of afterthought, just before we move to, I know we're going to do questions, is that I went back to Ukraine just before we had the pandemic. I was in Kyiv. What struck me then in early 2020 was that although there were people being killed in the Donbass, we had, I think, 20 or so people killed due to shelling. They were deliberately shelling power stations in what was a really cold Ukrainian winter. The response internationally was pretty muted. There was no big statement coming out from anywhere about what was happening here. And I did feel that people in Kyiv felt alone and felt that perhaps we weren't with them in the same way.
Thank you, Kathy. That was certainly, I found it gripping as you went through this series of events. As you say, we've now got about 15 minutes for questions, and can I just see people indicating to ask questions? I'll start with the gentleman there. Can you just indicate who you are? Or we haven't got a mic to hand? No? Sorry. Sorry about that.
Just shout for now.
Thank you very much. Raivo Kuusk, Ambassador of Estonia to Ukraine at the moment, but I just last summer arrived from Ukraine, where I was Ambassador for 4 years. Very interesting part of the symposium. Thank you very much. My question is about your sentence. You said several times, met and talked with Lavrov, and you asked him a question, why do you do that? I fell short of hearing what he answered.
By the way, I'm going to ask more questions in a second, but I'm keen that women in the audience will ask questions. I've been looking for you because I know there were people who want to contribute earlier. Would you like to deal with that one, Kathy, and then I'll look for other ones?
I deliberately didn't answer it in the hope that somebody would ask me. That's great. And it's lovely to see you. An Estonian voice is very obvious to me, I can hear. Essentially, it was like a looking glass moment that he would describe what he saw. And it's not that he described something that was completely wrong. It was just like looking in the other side of a mirror. If you've ever organised a demonstration, I certainly have, you will find that when you read the press reports of your demonstration, depending on who the press are, it will look very different. The numbers will be different, who was there will be different, who they choose to highlight as being in the demonstration will be different. And it was like that he saw this as much more about interference, that there were by this point quite a lot of people from the US Congress or from the European Parliament who'd gone into the square. There had been many more speeches by people from what would, let's call it the West, as it were. So he would use that to say, this is clearly inspired by all of you. This is not the people of Ukraine. And that he would see, people who he would think of as being more extreme or anti-Russian or whatever. And if you take a huge square full of people, you'll always be able to find people of different views. He chose to highlight the ones that he thought. And it was very clear that that's what their positioning was, whether they believed it or chose to believe it. And you still hear it now. When they talk about it now, it is about a group of people who they believe do not represent all of Ukraine, or most of it, who are anti-Russian, who are not supportive of the history of the country, and who are trying to move it in a direction it should not go. That's how they position it. And that really began way back then.
Okay, I'm going to take three. First of all, the woman in the white jacket that is there. Second, the gentleman there. And third, the gentleman there. Yes, please.
Baroness Ashton, Yanukovych, Program Director from Security and Defense from Ukrainian think tank and visiting scholar from the Center for Future Politics. Actually, it's very interesting because I was on one of your photos. It was in the Revolution of Dignity where you were taking the floor in Kyiv. And we were just coming with Ashton Yanukovych to Kyiv Security Forum. It was a young leaders meeting, so I remember your talk actually there. I was just on the second part that was behind the photo itself. My question actually is too much more burning and much more devastating to our heart. It's the Minsk agreement, and to your quote what you just said now, that Ukrainians at some moment were felt alone. And today, because we are talking not only about the EU, but of commemorating 75 years of NATO, I think it's a kind of a deja vu for Ukrainians. What would you reflect now, at this moment, about, as a Ukrainian, I can tell you, it never stopped us. And thank you also for all of the ambassadors whom I see, because I'm alumni of Estonian School of Diplomacy as well, so happy to see both of the ambassadors on our side. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more, Kathy, before coming back to you. Gentleman there.
Mediation. I'm Eric Fahrt. I was a military advisor to Angela Merkel between 2006 and 2013. Working together very close with Christoph Holzke, who you know very well. And I remember 5 years before the Maidan, we had this remarkable NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008. And you know that Germany and together with France were against membership of NATO, of Ukraine during that time. And one of our arguments, and we worked it out in many meetings together with Andrew, was the inner situation of Ukraine, not so much the approval of the Russians or not, and security demands of Russia, but the inner political situation. During our assessment, during that time, we thought that Ukraine is divided in this issue, that nearly 50% of European people have problems with that because of their relationships with Russia, and especially in the East Ukraine area, it was very difficult. One of our arguments was, and Angela Merkel stressed that during the first meetings of this summit, was the inner political situation in Ukraine was not ready for such membership. But 5 years later, must be a completely different situation. And do you have any information about what were the reasons of this change of mind in the Ukrainian population?
Thank you. Gentleman next to you.
Thank you, Hans Mortensen. My question is just what was the part played by Victoria Nuland and the US in these events?
Three interesting questions, Kathy.
So let me begin by saying that I stand in awe and admiration of the strength and determination of the Ukrainian people, and it's a great privilege when I have a chance to meet with old colleagues from Maidan, with old colleagues from around the governments of that time, and also to meet those who are really trying to lead and take Ukraine into the future. So that I say that. And I hope that Ukraine does not feel alone now. I hope that they've understood that one of the most remarkable things for me is how Europe has actually come together. There will always be nuances about how you do this. If you take 27 countries, sadly it's 27, not 28, 27 countries who operate very publicly, then you will hear every conversation. You will have it framed for you in different ways. So it is a very open process of coming together to a common position. But I think Europe has moved to a much better place and a much greater understanding of what is going on. And in the end, either Europe will be different at the end of this, or Russia will be different. And if Europe is different, it cannot possibly be good. And for the Baltic states, this is an incredibly important time as they look to their own futures, not just in terms of what could happen militarily, but all of the other ways that you can disrupt a nation. And again, lots of experience that will be in this room of how that happens and is happening right now. So my hope is that we'll see that determination continue despite all of the discussions that we hear about so openly. In the context of what happened in Bucharest and beyond, I think that when I went to Ukraine in 2013, having been there, as I said before, it was not as straightforward as it has become, in the sense that there were lots of people who wanted to make sure that they continued in a good relationship with Russia. This is before Russia did any level of invasion. That was very definitely why I was trying to balance and nuance what we were saying. And it was colleagues, and I have enormous respect for Angela Merkel and Christoph Heusgen, who was her advisor, I think, for 12 years. Christoph now runs the Munich Security Forum, an extraordinary diplomat. But, Putin lost Ukraine, didn't he? I mean, it's not a question of being anything other than crystal clear. He has lost any possibility of the people of Ukraine wanting to have the relationship with Russia and with Moscow and with him, because he has invaded their sovereignty. He has tried to take by military means, and they have resisted him. So to that extent, anything that happened before, from February 2022, is gone. And that, I think, is the most important moment, in a sense, for this, that all of those years before he was losing them, but now he's lost them completely. And Victoria Nuland. Well, Victoria is famous for two things in the Ukraine story.
Could you just describe for the audience as a whole who she is?
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to do. Victoria was Assistant Secretary of State, and she's famous for two things that you might have read about. One is giving out cookies in Maidan, which the Russians still talk about. I'm not kidding you, still talk about.
They were good.
Pardon?
They were that good.
I presume they were really, I never got any of them, but they were marvellous, clearly. But it was seen to be a symbol, or translated into some level of symbol of, this must be the CIA. I mean, the CIA does not give out cookies, I have to tell you. But nonetheless, she became very famous for that moment. And she also became famous for saying the famous F the EU, which got taped, which was quite funny, as we said to her when that story came out and she rang, you should hear what we say about you when you're not listening. You being America. So Victoria, I think, played an important and valuable role in pulling the American position into being much stronger and clearer about what was happening in Ukraine. She's tough, she's determined, and it was not always as clear as it is now, for these terrible reasons of the war, that when all this began, the things that you don't know are much greater than the things you do know. And just to sort of end on that note a bit, are you taking any more questions?
One more round.
Okay. Well, let me just say this one thing quickly, then I don't forget it. It's that a lot of people ask me, did we not see this coming with Russia? We'd had twice yearly summits with Moscow. We'd either been in Russia or they'd been in Brussels with both Putin and Medvedev in different guises. Surely they had said something. And I've checked this back with the people who were at the summits, the presidents of the EU, especially Jose Manuel Barroso. He and I have talked about this quite a lot in recent years. And they didn't. It only became an issue as we got towards the end. It only became an issue when they started to say, we need a three-way conversation. And as you know, the last thing you ever do if you're making a bilateral agreement is give the third party a veto.
Final round of three. Lady in the front, gentleman over there, gentleman there. Oh, okay.
Thank you. Well, I'm Anna Wieslander. I'm Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council. And my question is on Russia again. We heard from the previous panel that the Baltic states, Poland often say you can only meet Russia from a position of strength. You had Yanukovych, as you said, telling you that he was under a lot of pressure from Russia in fall 2013. What are your reflections on the instruments that the EU had at this point in putting leverage on Russia and support Ukraine in what they wanted towards the West? That would be very interesting to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Second of my question is
thank you. The dominant narrative today is that we have been too weak vis-a-vis Russia and we should have been stronger, and that we could have perhaps prevented what we are seeing today. But there is also an alternative narrative, and that is that we were too supercilious, showing the cold shoulder towards Russia. And I mention one example. I recall when we had, prior to the Maidan events, some 1 or 2 years before that, we had Sergei Lavrov visiting us as our lunch guest at the foreign ministers' meeting. And he said at the meeting that when you started the Eastern Partnership with the 6 countries, we were in contact with the Commission and said that we would like to join as observers, but we got no reply. And nobody of the 27 ministers, nor of the Commissioner present, commented on Lavrov's statement. And 3 weeks later we had the next meeting of the foreign ministers' lunch without Lavrov. We were talking about Russia, and I reminded that Lavrov said 3 weeks ago that nobody replied. Nobody commented this either, and I found this rather strange and sort of indicative of something that fueled the Russian narrative and the Russian view that this was about creating a European sphere of influence, which it was not. To my mind, in any way, we were genuinely interested in giving a warm welcome to these 6 countries, but not shutting out Russia. That was not our intention. It may have been the intention of some of our, because there were some people also among our ministers who had a different profile, and these were, of course, alerted to Russians. So the question is that my own answer is no, I don't think it would have changed anything. But the question is that had we been more forthcoming, not only on this issue, but on many other issues as well, showing the Russian people, not only the leadership, the people, that there are benefits in cooperating with the West and integrating with the West, would that have prevented what we are seeing today? I don't think so myself, but I don't know for sure. But neither do we know that had we had a stronger policy before, that would have prevented it. Maybe we would have seen this only earlier.
Thank you. I've got 2 more. Gentleman there and gentleman there.
Vytautas Bruveris, News Agency Alta, Lithuania. Now what? I mean, the situation where the things are decided on the battleground. What is your take in a more broader context? Because there is a lot of people see, and there is ever-growing danger that Russians can get real breakthrough on the front lines, not only on tactical but on a strategical level, that closer to the end of the spring or on the summer, Ukrainian front lines and Ukrainian defenses could be getting collapsed. So what can or must be done at this in this situation to stop it? And a lot of people say that the only way out is some kind of new negotiations, some kind of new Minsk, new partition of the country. So I wonder what are your takes on that?
The final question, the gentleman over there.
John Saropoulos, I'm Al Jazeera's correspondent in Athens, so a long way from all of this, but most of my reporting has been about Ukraine for the past 2 years now. Do you think, having seen one EU process go down in flames with Ukraine, the EU membership process is now in earnest? And what do you think will be its result? And do you think that this whole experience is leading to growth within the EU of a more coherent foreign policy and possibly defence policy in future, possibly during the period of Joseph Borrell.
Thank you very much. 4 very good questions. Kathy, could you deal with those and also include any wind-up comments of any kind you'd like to make following this session?
Okay. Forgive me if I forget all the questions. I'm going to start with the instruments that the EU has at its disposal at that time. Well, I'm a huge believer that we don't take diplomacy seriously enough. The book I wrote was a homage to diplomats, really. It's about saying that... He's very good. It's about saying that through the stories that I tell, come with me and see what diplomacy is about. But we're not good at creating... in our European structures or in our national structures, I think the diplomatic pool of resources that you actually need. I think of it really sometimes as the other side of what we do in security in military terms, that you really do need a strong group of people able to be deployed to be able to do all sorts of different jobs. So the diplomatic toolkit is never big enough, and at the moment it's very heavily reliant on sanctions as the method or mechanism. But we tend to think of sanctions as an end, not a means, and they are a means to an end. You put on sanctions in order to make something happen or stop happening. We tend to think we've put on the sanctions, job done. The job is not done. So I think for the EU at the time and now, just as I think for many countries, we could do with reviewing all of the different ways that we can try and make things happen. And that's partly about relationships outside, because no issue can be resolved alone. It's about making sure that you are developing your diplomatic relationships with all kinds of countries, organisations and people in order that they then become part of the fabric of how you tackle a problem. And you can see that with Ukraine now. There are lots of countries who believe in the same things that we believe in, but who are not participating in helping and supporting this process, that we need to think about how we develop that. So the instruments at our disposal were a combination of the pressure, the stick, and the carrots, which was about energy and trade and all of the things that we believe, and we shouldn't throw away just because we can see all of the negative sides, as being tools and implements that you can use to solve problems, prevent problems, to help those in trouble. And certainly for Ukraine, how we use our trade and development tools is going to be incredibly important in the future. Erki, your question about would it have been any different if we'd had a different relationship with Russia, taken them more seriously? I hear that a lot, and it's an important and interesting debate to have. From my own perspective, we were working with Russia on all sorts of issues, that from the Iran talks, because remember, I was chairing and leading the Iran negotiations right the way through this period where Russia was a partner. They were one of the team. And I was moving from Vienna, where we were negotiating the Iran deal with the Russians, to Kyiv, where we were absolutely explaining publicly and privately that Russia was playing a very bad role here, and then flying back and carrying on with the Russians. And they were doing the same. They were going back to Moscow and attacking the EU, and then flying back to the talks with the EU. So there was a lot going on. There were a lot of opportunities that had Russia decided it wanted to take a different course or wanted to have more relationships or have more conversations and dialogue, it could. This is about Putin's desire for history and legacy. He looks back on the Russian Empire. This is not about the Soviet Union in my view. He sees what Russia should be in his terms and is determined to recreate it. And he is not, as a legacy, going to be the president that loses Ukraine. Those are the things I think about how he operates and what he thinks in this particular context. And those things were set already. It's just that we hadn't seen them because they'd not surfaced in a way that we could have reacted to. They were beyond the Lavrov lunch, which I remember well. You know, that was Lavrov being Lavrov, talking about something. I didn't see it as what I should have seen it as, which is a precursor for what was to come. but I'm not sure he did either. I've forgotten the third question.
I think you've dealt with them, actually. He's talking about the current situation. How do you see the current situation?
How do I see this current situation? It's very hard for me to know.
I do have a crystal ball here.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to know. I've heard consistently through the course of this war that Ukraine may not get the weapons it needs, may not get the bullets it needs, may not be able to sustain, and yet they do. And so the determination of the Ukrainian people to continue to stop Russia from taking more, or in a way to push it back to take less, and all of that, and to eventually get the sovereignty of their country back, is absolutely clear in my mind. That's what they are seeking to do. Wars end eventually, and they never end with straight lines. They end with ragged endings. Things have to be sorted out. Negotiations have to take place. Even if you win everything, there are thousands of children who've disappeared into Russia. There are people from Russia living in parts of Ukraine. There are lots of things that have to happen at the end of a war. So my personal view is, even in the midst of war, you have to be thinking about what are you going to talk about, and what are the issues that are going to have to be resolved, whatever the outcome is that you finally determine is that moment. But as I've said from the beginning, it's for Ukraine to determine, not for me.
Cathy, can I... No, I'm not going to allow you to come back.
EU. No, EU. He just wants to ask me that. Let me answer the last question. Membership of the EU. Membership of the EU is a long, complicated and difficult business, as you will know, and other countries will remember well. It takes a great deal of energy and effort to fulfill the acquis, as somebody mentioned earlier, and to be able to achieve the opening and closing of all of the chapters. Which is why I think the EU is right to think about how to draw Ukraine closer while that process is going on. I do think it's made the EU stronger in foreign policy terms. I do think it's made them more coherent. It doesn't mean it's perfect. These are sovereign nations working together. It's not one entity. And we should never forget that they are sovereign countries making decisions collectively. And it's absolutely extraordinary to me, and always was, how willing countries are to actually try and push together and work together on different issues. And I certainly remember that from my time in office. It's more true now.
Cathy, it's been an absolutely gripping session, really tense and exciting, as you've talked. Thank you so much for giving the time. And I'd just like to thank you on behalf of everyone.